I never imagined that moving into my dream apartment would become a living nightmare, all because of the man living right next door. My name is Olivia, and 6 months ago, I thought I'd finally caught a break. After years of cramped studio apartments and terrible roommates, I found the perfect one-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was reasonable, the landlord seemed decent, and best of all, it was mine alone. No more dealing with other people's mess, no more noise complaints. Just peace and quiet to focus on my freelance graphic design work. The building was old but charming, with thick walls and only 4 units total. I was in 2B, and my only immediate neighbor was the guy in 2A, a man I'd guess was in his 50s, always impeccably dressed, with the kind of rigid posture that screamed former military or corporate middle management. His name was Gerald Hoffman, and in our first brief hallway encounter, he seemed polite enough. Maybe a little intense with his handshake and direct eye contact. But nothing alarming. I should have paid more attention to that intensity. For the first month, everything was perfect. I'd set up my home office in the living room, with my computer facing the large window that looked out onto the courtyard. I kept regular hours, rarely played music loud enough for anyone to hear, and made sure to keep my apartment spotless. I'd learned from previous bad experiences with landlords that first impressions matter, and I wanted to establish myself as the ideal tenant. That's when Gerald's behavior started getting weird. It began with the staring. I'd be working at my desk and catch movement in my peripheral vision. When I'd look up, Gerald would be standing at his window, watching me. Not glancing over casually like normal neighbors do, actively watching, sometimes for minutes at a time. When our eyes would meet, he wouldn't look away embarrassed like most people would. Instead, he'd give this little nod, as if to acknowledge that yes, he was watching me, and no, he wasn't going to stop. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just curious about the new neighbor. Maybe he was bored. Maybe his window just happened to face mine and I was being paranoid. But the staring continued, and it started expanding beyond just the window. I'd leave my apartment and find him lingering in the hallway, always with some excuse, checking his mail for the 3rd time that day, or wiping down his already spotless doorframe. But his eyes would track my every movement. Then came the first complaint to the landlord. I was working late one Tuesday night, probably around 10 p.m., when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Chin, my landlord, and she sounded irritated. "Alex, I've received a complaint about excessive noise coming from your unit. Music playing too loud, stomping around, that sort of thing. I need you to be more considerate of your neighbors." I was confused. "Mrs. Chen, I haven't been playing any music. I've been working quietly at my computer all evening." "Well, that's what was reported. Just keep it down, okay?" I hung up, completely baffled. The only sound in my apartment was the quiet hum of my computer fan. I looked toward Gerald's window and saw the curtains quickly fall back into place. That's when I realized what was happening. The second complaint came a week later. This time it was about strange smells coming from my apartment. Mrs. Chin mentioned concerns about illegal substances or improper cooking that might be violating the lease. I had to invite her over for an inspection just to prove that my apartment smelled like nothing more offensive than the vanilla candle I occasionally lit while working. She left looking embarrassed and confused, but not before warning me that multiple complaints could result in eviction proceedings. That night, I decided to test my theory. I sat in complete darkness and silence for 3 hours, just watching Gerald's window. Sure enough, around 11 p.m., I saw him at his window with what looked like a notepad, scribbling something down. The next morning, Mrs. Chen called about a complaint regarding loud television late at night. Gerald was deliberately lying about me. But why? I'd never done anything to him. We'd barely spoken beyond polite hallway greetings. I kept to myself, paid my rent on time, and followed every building rule to the letter. The only thing I could think of was that maybe he'd wanted my apartment for someone he knew, or maybe he just didn't like having neighbors at all. Whatever his motivation, his campaign was working. Mrs. Chen was becoming increasingly suspicious of me, and I could hear the doubt in her voice every time she called. She'd stopped taking my word at face value and started asking probing questions about my daily activities. The stress was affecting my work, my sleep, and my mental health. I knew I had to do something, but confronting Gerald directly seemed like it would only escalate the situation. He was clearly comfortable lying to authority figures, so what would stop him from telling Mrs. Chen that I'd threatened or harassed him? I needed a different approach. That's when I decided to fight fire with fire. If Gerald wanted to play psychological games, I could play them too. But I wouldn't stoop to his level of outright lying. Instead, I would use his own paranoia and obsessive behavior against him. It started small. Gerald had a very rigid routine. I'd observed this during weeks of his surveillance. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., he'd retrieve his newspaper from outside his door. He'd check his mailbox at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. sharp, even though mail was only delivered once a day. He'd take his garbage out every Tuesday at 6 p.m., and he'd water the small plant by his door every other day at precisely 5:30 p.m. I began making tiny changes to his environment. On Tuesday morning, I took his newspaper and placed it 3 inches to the left of where it normally was. Not missing, not damaged, just slightly off. I watched through my peephole. As he opened his door at exactly 7 a.m., he stopped, stared at the newspaper for a long moment, then looked around the hallway suspiciously before picking it up. The next day, I moved it 3 inches to the right. Gerald spent 5 full minutes examining the hallway, checking corners, and looking up at the ceiling as if searching for hidden cameras. He knocked on the door of 1A, the elderly woman downstairs, and I could hear him asking if she'd seen anyone in the hallway. She politely told him no. After a week of this, Gerald started coming out at 6:50 a.m. to wait for the newspaper delivery. So I switched tactics. His mailbox key had a small piece of tape wrapped around it to distinguish it from his other keys. One day, while he was out, I carefully removed the tape and reapplied it in a slightly different position. Not enough that someone else would notice, but enough that someone obsessively familiar with their own belongings might. Gerald spent 15 minutes examining his keys that afternoon, comparing them to each other, even taking photos with his phone as if documenting evidence. I escalated slowly and carefully. His doormat would be askew by half an inch. The plant by his door would be rotated so it faced a slightly different direction. Once, I very carefully loosened his door number, 2A, so it hung slightly crooked. These weren't destructive acts or anything that could get me in trouble. They were just inconsistencies in his perfectly ordered world. The beautiful thing was that Gerald's own obsessive personality made these tiny changes feel enormous to him. Someone who pays attention to every detail is also someone who notices when those details are wrong. But the real genius of my plan was yet to come. I'd noticed that Gerald kept detailed logs of everything. Through my window, I could see him at his kitchen table every evening, writing in a notebook. Given his complaints to Mrs. Chen, I assumed he was documenting my supposed violations. I decided to give him something more interesting to document. I started creating patterns that existed just at the edge of believability. For instance, I noticed that Gerald always checked his mailbox at 11 a.m. So I began making small noises at 10:58, not loud enough to disturb anyone else, but loud enough for someone listening carefully to hear. I'd drop a pen, or close a drawer with slightly more force than necessary. Always at 10:58. Never at any other time. After 2 weeks of this, I watched Gerald standing in the hallway at 10:55, waiting and listening. He'd pulled out his phone to record, but the noises were so brief and ordinary that he had nothing incriminating to capture. Then I started varying the pattern. Noise at 10:58 for 5 days, then silence for 3 days. Then noise at 10:58 for 2 days, then silence for 1 day. Random enough that Gerald couldn't predict it, but patterned enough that his paranoid mind would insist there was significance to it. I could see him through his window, pacing and writing frantically in his notebook, trying to decode meaning from meaningless coincidences. But my masterpiece was the mirror trick. Gerald's bathroom window faced the courtyard, and he never bothered with curtains, because it was frosted glass. But at certain times of day, when the light was right, you could make out shadows and movement inside. I'd noticed he always took a shower at exactly 6:30 p.m. I bought a small, cheap mirror and positioned it outside my window in such a way that it would reflect light toward his bathroom window, but only when the sun was at a very specific angle, and only for about 10 minutes each day. It created a brief, unexplained flash of light in his bathroom that coincided with his shower time. The first time it happened, I watched Gerald cut his shower short and come to his main window, looking around the courtyard suspiciously. The flash was already gone, and there was no obvious source for it. This went on for a week. Every day, a mysterious flash of light in his bathroom at 6:30 p.m. That lasted just long enough for him to notice, but was gone by the time he could investigate. I watched him install a small camera in his bathroom window, aimed at the courtyard. But my mirror was positioned in such a way that it was just outside the camera's field of view. So his recordings showed nothing unusual, even though he was still experiencing the phenomenon. By this point, Gerald was clearly becoming unhinged. I could see him at all hours of the night, standing at his windows, watching and waiting for something to happen. His perfectly maintained appearance was starting to slip, his usually precise hair was disheveled, his clothes less pristine. The obsessive behavior that he'd once directed at spying on me was now consuming his entire life as he tried to solve the mystery of his own disturbed environment. The complaints to Mrs. Chen stopped completely. Gerald was too busy dealing with his own perceived problems to worry about fabricating problems with me. But I wasn't done yet. For my final move, I decided to make Gerald question not just his environment, but his own memory and sanity. I waited for a day when I knew Gerald would be out. He had a standing appointment somewhere every Thursday at 2 p.m. Using a technique I'd learned from my graphic design work with security systems, I created a fake building management notice. It looked official, complete with the building's letterhead that I'd recreated from legitimate notices I'd received. The notice, dated 1 week in the past, informed residents that maintenance would be conducting routine inspections of door alignment and mailbox functionality, and that residents might notice minor adjustments to fixtures and hardware. It apologized for any inconvenience and reminded residents that these inspections were covered in Section 12.3 of the lease agreement. I slipped this notice under Gerald's door while he was out. When he returned, I watched through my peephole as he discovered the notice. He read it 3 times, then immediately went to check his door and mailbox. For the first time in weeks, I saw his face relax slightly. he'd found an explanation for all the minor changes he'd been experiencing. But here's the thing, the notice was post-dated to a week ago, and Gerald was obsessive about checking his mail and any building communications. If this notice had really been delivered a week ago, he would have seen it then. Now he had to confront the possibility that either his memory was failing, or he'd somehow missed an important notice despite his meticulous attention to detail. I watched him search through stacks of papers in his apartment, looking for the notice he was sure he must have filed away somewhere. When he couldn't find it, he started questioning whether he'd actually received it when it was originally delivered. Maybe he'd been distracted. Maybe he'd thrown it away by mistake. Maybe his mind wasn't as sharp as he thought it was. The doubt was eating him alive. Over the next few days, Gerald's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd been so confident in his perception of reality, so certain that he was the observant one, the one who noticed everything. Now that foundation was crumbling. He started second-guessing himself constantly. Was his newspaper really in the wrong place, or had he misremembered where it usually was? Was his plant turned differently, or was he just noticing its position for the first time? Had that flash of light in his bathroom really happened, or was he so paranoid that he was imagining things? The more he doubted his own perceptions, the less reliable they became. It's a psychological principle. When you start questioning your memory and senses, you become more prone to false memories and misperceptions. Gerald was trapped in a cycle of self-doubt that I'd helped create, but which was now sustaining itself. 2 weeks after the fake notice, Gerald knocked on my door. He looked terrible, unshaven, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes red and unfocused. When I answered, he seemed surprised to see me, as if he'd forgotten I existed. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice shaky. "I know we don't really know each other. But, have you noticed anything strange lately? In the building, I mean. Anything out of place? Or different?" I looked at him with what I hoped was genuine concern. "Strange how? Is everything okay, Gerald?" He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't know. I thought. I've been thinking that maybe someone's been messing with my things, moving stuff around, but then I found this notice about maintenance inspections, and I can't remember if I saw it before, and..." He trailed off, seeming to realize how crazy he sounded. "That sounds really stressful," I said sympathetically. "Have you talked to Mrs. Chin about it? Maybe she could clarify about the maintenance work." Gerald's face went pale. Of course, if he called Mrs. Chin about the notice, she'd tell him that no such maintenance had been scheduled. The notice was fake, and calling about it would only prove that his reality was fundamentally unreliable. No, I haven't called her yet," he mumbled. "I'm sure it's nothing. Sorry to bother you." He shuffled back to his apartment, and I didn't see him for the next 3 days. When Gerald finally emerged, he was a different person. The rigid posture was gone, replaced by a nervous, uncertain way of moving. He no longer stared at me through the windows. In fact, he seemed to actively avoid looking in my direction, as if I might see the confusion and doubt in his eyes. The transformation was remarkable. The man who had been so confident in his perceptions, so sure of his right to monitor and judge his neighbors, was now terrified of trusting his own senses. Every small inconsistency in his environment, every minor variation in his routine, sent him spiraling into self-doubt. I'd won, but I hadn't done it through lies or deception aimed at others. I'd simply used Gerald's own obsessive nature to trap him in a prison of uncertainty. He'd become so focused on trying to control and monitor everything around him that he'd lost the ability to distinguish between real changes and imagined ones. The complaints to Mrs. Chen never resumed. Gerald was too busy questioning his own sanity to worry about fabricating problems with mine. 6 months later, Gerald moved out. I watched from my window as the movers loaded his belongings into a truck. His possessions were packed with obsessive care, every box labeled in his precise handwriting, but the man himself looked defeated. He never looked back at the building as the truck drove away. Mrs. Chen mentioned to me later that Gerald had broken his lease early, claiming he needed to move for health reasons. She seemed puzzled by his sudden departure, especially since he'd been such a model tenant in terms of paying rent on time and maintaining his apartment. Quiet guy, though, she added. Never caused any trouble. I nodded and agreed that yes, he had seemed very quiet. As I write this, I'm still in the same apartment. It's peaceful now, just as I'd originally hoped it would be. I can work without feeling watched, I can live without worrying about false complaints, and I can sleep without wondering what lies are being told about me. Some people might say what I did was cruel. That driving someone to question their own sanity is a form of psychological torture. And maybe they're right. But Gerald chose to wage a war of lies and manipulation against an innocent neighbor. He chose to try to destroy my housing situation and my peace of mind for no reason other than his own twisted need for control. I simply gave him a taste of his own medicine, the experience of feeling paranoid, watched, and uncertain about reality. The only difference was that his paranoia was based on actual manipulation, while mine had been based on false accusations. In the end, Gerald learned what it felt like to be on the receiving end of psychological games. And apparently, he didn't like it any more than I had. The irony is that if Gerald had just minded his own business from the beginning, if he'd been the normal, quiet neighbor that Mrs. Chen believed him to be, none of this would have happened. We could have coexisted peacefully, each in our own space, bothering no one. But Gerald chose to make me his enemy, and in doing so, he created the very situation he'd tried to fabricate with his lies to the landlord. He made himself the victim of the kind of neighbor harassment he'd falsely accused me of. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's giving someone exactly what they deserve. And Gerald got exactly what he deserved, a taste of his own paranoid, obsessive medicine, served with a side of poetic justice. I still live in that apartment, and I've never had a problem with neighbors since. Turns out, when you treat people with respect and mind your own business, they tend to do the same for you. Gerald never learned that lesson, but thanks to our little game of psychological chess, he finally experienced what it felt like to be on the wrong end of it. And somehow, I think that was the most educational experience he'd had in years.